Hello. In this talk I'm going to be thinking about how to defeat a Seljuk Turkish army during the era of the Crusades, focusing in particular on how the Franks, or people from Western Christendom, defeated Turkish armies during this era, and that could be either Crusader armies or the armies deployed by the Crusader states, which were a series of territories created by the First Crusade along the coastline of the Near East. So to begin with, let's have a look at the two very different types of armies deployed by these different civilizations. On one hand, you have the Seljuk Turks. Now the Seljuk Turks, their background lies in the Central Asian steppe, where nomadic peoples would raise their children to ride and shoot and hunt from a very early age, and naturally these are all skills with military applications. Now, by the time of the Crusades and with the conquest of much of the Near East by the Turks, these techniques have proved extremely effective. And of course, over time, the armies of the Seljuk Sultanate gained experience, picked up new ideas, techniques and weapons and armour from the various people they conquered. But they still fight in much the same way, which is essentially as mounted archers. Now, most Turkish armies have some formations of heavily armoured troops, but the vast majority of a Turkish army would have been mounted, lightly armoured archers. And there are various strengths and weaknesses here. Mobility is the biggest strength. Also, the ability to mass archers together in a single unit and then pour arrows upon your opponent. That too could be very decisive. Nevertheless, there are some weaknesses. Turkish armies from this era are generally lightly armoured, and many of the mounted archers are less well suited for hand-to-hand combat than their more heavily armoured opponents. Their horses were generally smaller than those deployed by many of their opponents, and that includes the Crusaders. So there are strengths and weaknesses here, and as with most forms of war, their interests were to maximise their strengths and to mitigate their weaknesses. But who are they fighting against? Well, in battles where Turkish armies fought against Crusader Frankish armies, the Frankish armies were normally organised in a very different way. Frankish armies came from predominantly farming, agricultural societies, and their army's structure reflects this. And so just as in society you'd have lots of farmers and then a local knight or a local lord, so in armies you have large numbers of infantry who naturally fight on foot, and then you have smaller squadrons of elite cavalry, and it's the cavalry who have the better mounts, armour, weapons, etc. Now, the great strength of Frankish armies is hand-to-hand combat. They're very heavily armoured, wearing chainmail armour of this era, and they become more and more armoured as time goes on, which makes them harder to defeat. But they are dependent on their logistics. They need to supply their army with convoys of wagons. They're also fairly slow moving. Now, Frankish armies do have a fair number of archers in their ranks. Occasionally they were poorly provided for with archers, and so during the Second Crusade, the army of King Conrad III of Germany, for example, suffered very badly whilst trying to cross Anatolia, because it had very few archers and therefore no real response to the various hit-and-run attacks staged by its Turkish opponents. But many Frankish armies, particularly the armies of the Crusader states, had a great many archers, including large numbers of crossbowmen who were feared as a major opponent and who threatened the ballistic powers of the Turkish armies of this era. So, how did Frankish armies seek to defeat their Turkish opponents? Well, Frankish armies have one really big advantage, and that is their formations of very, very heavily armoured knights. And these knights could be battle winners. because if they could get their formations of knights to impact and engage squadrons of, say, Turkish mounted archers in hand-to-hand combat, then there was a very good chance those knights would stampede those Turkish mounted archers, and then by staging further charges they would then stampede other formations until they routed the entire army. And it's quite common for Frankish armies of this era to charge in waves. The idea being that the first wave will force the Turkish mounted archers to cluster in order to get away from the first wave, and the second wave then hits where they cluster, and then the third wave hits where they cluster again until ultimately the Turkish army is routed. And this can be very effective. And it's notable that during the First Crusade, during one of the battles that took place during the siege of Antioch, when Ridwan, ruler of Aleppo, marched out to fight the armies of the First Crusade, that Bohemond of Taranto, one of the First Crusade commanders, he staged a surprise attack on the Turkish army in exactly this way, wave after wave of knights. The first wave assault in the middle of the Turkish army, and the other waves attacking anywhere where they clustered until the army eventually broke. Other approaches adopted by Frankish armies of this era were to wait for moments when their Turkish opponents were clustered in a single place. And so that could just be the way that they were deployed, but a particular favourite for Frankish commanders of this era was to assault Turkish armies whilst they were in camp. And so we know of several occasions when, often at first light in the morning, Frankish armies would stage a sudden charge against their opponent's encampment before their Turkish opponents had a chance to mount and to get out of the way of the Frankish charge. And so, for example, in 1163, when Nur al-Din sought to invade the county of Tripoli near the castle of Crac de Chevalier, a charge of this kind was used, which caused his army to be destroyed or at least routed, and Nur al-Din himself only narrowly escaped from the pursuing Frankish knights. So the key weapon for Frankish armies in order to defeat their Turkish opponents was to make sure their cavalry charge hit home. And we hear of various approaches used to try and augment these cavalry charges. On one occasion, squadrons of knights from the county of Edessa attached burning torches to their lances to amplify the effect of their charge. Now, as time went on, of course, Turkish commanders and later Kurdish commanders, with the rise of Saladin and the Ayyubid dynasty, they became aware that this was a major vulnerability. And so you hear increasingly stories of Turkish or Ayyubid commanders heavily fortifying their encampments. And so in 1183, during one of the really big encounters between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's armies, the two forces faced each other for several days with no battle taking place, and the Franks couldn't stage a charge because Saladin had very heavily fortified his encampment, which he had located in territory that simply wasn't suitable for a Frankish cavalry charge. So that's perhaps the number one weapon at the Franks' disposal in trying to defeat a Turkish army. But there were others, or at least other approaches they could adopt that would make them very hard to defeat themselves. And one of these approaches was to adopt what's called a fighting march formation. And a fighting march formation is basically a way that a Frankish army can get from one place to another whilst constantly being attacked by hit and run groups of Turkish archers, while suffering very few casualties themselves and inflicting heavy casualties on their Turkish opponents. And what a fighting march looks like is basically the army is deployed so that its wagons and its horses are at the centre of the army. But then around the periphery of these squadrons of knights and groups of wagons, you've then got a shell of infantry forces equipped with large shields to ward off arrows and spears to ward off horsemen, but also then ranks of soldiers equipped with crossbows to shoot down any Turkish cavalry that came within range. And these fighting marches could be very effective indeed, and they were very hard to break. In fact, in the period between the First Crusade and the Battle of Hattin, I've identified only 2 occasions when a Frankish fighting march was broken, and indeed one of those was during the Battle of Hattin. But that formation was a way of playing to the Frankish army's strengths, using its defensibility and its crossbows to defeat the oncoming Turkish light cavalry archers who might otherwise have worn them down. Other things that Frankish and Crusader armies did could include marching at night, because again, that is a way of offsetting their opponent's advantages, because if you march at night, it's not very easy to shoot at night, and so therefore you could march with much less danger of suffering heavy casualties should you be attacked. And so we hear of several examples of Frankish armies marching at night and then encamping during the day, specifically because they're aware of their opponent's strengths in war. Another approach was to fight in the rain, because Turkish bows were made of layers of bone and horn connected by layers of glue made from melting down hooves, which would then be used to seal the various layers together. The problem is with those bows, and indeed the bow strings, they actually performed very poorly when it was raining. So that could be another stratagem that the Crusaders adopted, or indeed in high winds, which would have the same effect. Another development that occurred increasingly as the 12th and 13th century progressed is to enforce strict discipline, because Turkish tactics very much hinged on the ability to break up their opponents and then defeat individual groups of Franks or Crusaders independently. And so to mitigate that, the Franks enforced very, very strict discipline. No one was allowed to break ranks. No one was allowed to leave the marching army without approval. And so therefore this was a way, again, of trying to address the Turks' very substantial strengths in warfare. Okay, so this has just been a whistle-stop tour in the various approaches used by Frankish armies to defeat their Turkish opponents. I hope you found it interesting. Please do look at the other videos in this collection. Thank you.